2022 has blown by, and with it another year in the history books, but more importantly another year of Genshin Impact content. In this video I'll be going over all the key moments and content drops for Genshin Impact in the year 2022. Brace yourselves because it was a busy year. Genshin Impact's 2022 started with a very strong patch being 2.4, which released on January 5th. 2.4's event banners consisted of Shenhe and Yunjin as the new characters, as well as reruns for Zhao, Zhongli, and Ganyu. It introduced the Archon quest to rebuild the Jade Chamber. The limited time events for this patch were also very solid, the main one being the second Lantern Rite, which has always been pretty generous with the rewards, especially this time. They also brought Windtrace back, a fan favorite. Basically it's prop hunt, but fan favorite nonetheless. Next is 8 locales over mountains and seas. It's what I would call a filler event. There's some nice moments with the Tanuki, but there's nothing substantial. It's a study in potions, which was somewhat controversial. It was a combat event that veteran players found to be pretty easy and the earlier AR players to find incredibly daunting. Now on to the new characters, and starting with the 4-star, which is a Geo polearm character. Yunjin has a fun parry mechanic and does a generally good job empowering normal attack DPSs. So because of those reasons, she was pretty well received at the time of her release and has continued to be well received to this day. The new 5-star Shenhe was a cryo polearm character with a very specific kit, albeit very strong. Not only did she increase her team's cryo damage, but she also shredded enemy resistances. This banner would be the only banner we would get for Shenhe of the year, which is slightly surprising considering her sales were solid. Not amazing, but solid. Now moving on to the biggest addition of 2.4 was the new area Enkanomiya. From an artistic standpoint, Enkanomiya is a masterclass, with graphics, art, and sound design that are all unquestionably superb. But I think most people would agree that not having voice lines for the main quest line there was a mistake. Enkanomiya was also an extremely lore-rich area, finally giving some answers on some of the greater mysteries in the world of Teyvat. And the last aspect I want to touch on is the traversal of Enkanomiya. This is more of a personal preference, but some people would classify Enkanomiya's traversal as bad. Regardless of it not being a perfect area, it is without a doubt still a very solid addition to this game, and a great way to start the year of 2022. And lastly, here are the enemies that were added into the game in 2.4. And yeah, let's continue on. 2.4 was definitely a tough act to follow up, but I think 2.5 is pretty good for what it is. 2.5 came out February 16th, and the big hitter for that patch was definitely the Raiden Shogun boss fight. The boss fight was unlocked at the end of Raiden Shogun's story quest, and they also added Yae Miko's story quest because she became the new 5-star playable character in this patch. They also added on to Enkanomiya some more by adding a few more enemies that you are seeing on screen now. These enemies are generally considered to be counters to shield characters, and I think they are worthy of being in the game, as are all the Enkanomiya enemies. So on the limited banners, Phase 1 was Yae Miko, but Phase 2 was Raiden Shogun and Kokomi. At the time, this is the first Kokomi rerun, and if anyone was playing the game back when Kokomi first came out, you would recall she was the most hated 5-star. This was also the first Raiden Shogun rerun, and as you can imagine, most people at that time probably pulled for Raiden Shogun. The Yae Miko banner definitely performed above average, but the Raiden Shogun and Kokomi banners were at that time the best-selling banners ever. Now, going back to Yae Miko for a minute, as a 5-star Electro sub DPS, Yae Miko was in a bit of a tough spot when she came out. There was already quite a few options for sub DPS Electro characters, and some of her kit focused on EM, which at the time was very out of place because Dendro did not exist yet. Add on top of that some people felt her basic attacks were clunky, which is a problem I've heard people talk about before when it comes to Catalyst characters, and she got some flack when she first came out. Going forward in this overview, she will not be the only character to face this issue. Regardless of all of that, Yae Miko was a decent unit back then and is a very strong unit today. Now on to what most people consider one of the best weekly boss fights. Raiden Shogun, the puppet, and the spirit, I guess, they're fighting over the body of the puppet because the puppet thinks that is not pursuing eternity anymore. So it's like a big battle between two gods that are both like children, but they're not children, they're like super old, essentially. Okay, I could have explained that better, but that's basically what's going on, right? And even though I just kind of made fun of it a little bit, it is a great boss fight. The big limited time event for 2.5 was 3 Realms Gateway Offering, which was actually an event centered around Enkanomiya. It basically rewarded exploration, and there was also a pretty cool boss fight with 2 fish apps. The next event is Of Drink A Dreaming, which is basically a bartender simulator. One of the more chill events, but I think it's pretty cool. Moving on to Divine Ingenuity, a really cool event if underutilized. Later on in the event, you can create custom domains and have people try out your courses, and the creativity that people had with this event is astonishing. But the problem that most people, myself included, have is that it was a limited time event, so it just disappears. Still really cool, I just wish it was permanent. The last event for this patch was Haikunin Ikki. This is quite the fan favorite, so I don't even think I need to explain it. And it also comes back in 3.1. Alright, so that wraps up 2.5. Now let's move on to 2.6, which has another new area, the Chasm. I don't want to begin talking about 2.6 without first mentioning how long this patch lasted. Due to lockdowns in China, this patch lasted a total of 2 months. MiHoYo did try to remedy this by adding a few extra events towards the latter half of the patch, but it definitely dragged on. I don't want to detract from an otherwise great patch, however, so let me get on to what this patch had. To keep it short, as I'll be talking about it more later, the Chasm is a brilliantly designed area, and to me it foreshadows what they had in mind when they started designing Sumeru as well. The story and lore aspect were also well done, if a little stingy on some of the greater details. This patch also had new artifacts, a very fun limited time event, a very fun new 5-star, and it also added a really annoying boss to fight, but hey, a boss is a boss. Going back to that very fun 5-star I was talking about, it's the Hydro Sword character Kamisato Ayato. He not only came out with a kit that looked good, sounded good, and felt good to play, but he also was strong to boot. The comparisons between Ayato and Tartaglia pretty much happened immediately, as they filled very similar roles on most team comps. And while I'm not going to compare those two here in this video, I will say very quickly that Ayato's banner sold remarkably well. Although even take that with a grain of salt, because that is only specifically the iOS Asian market. And that also does include Venti sales as well, because Venti was ran with Ayato in this patch. The Phase 2 banner is where things get really weird for 2.6. It was Kamisato Ayaka, and her banner lasted all the way from April 19th to May 31st. Which is a big reason why to this day it is still the best selling banner. Now finally getting back into the Chasm, the story, without spoiling too much, follows the Traveler reuniting with Dainsleif and once again fighting the Abyss Order. Throughout this story you also learn a bit more about the Traveler's sibling. The aspects that the Chasm shines at the most are actually the ones that players critique Enkanomiya about, which is the exploration. When exploring the Chasm it feels nearly bottomless. As players slowly progress through the Chasm little by little, you encounter different layers. Sometimes it would be green and full of life, and then other times darkness or even waterfalls. And all of these different elements flow seamlessly. The constant environmental change will keep you on your toes, and as players are exploring, it just feels never ending. I believe until much later in 2022 when Sumeru came out, the Chasm was the best area ever made in Genshin Impact. Hues of the Violet Garden was the main event for 2.6. It takes place in Inazuma and centers around the Irodori Festival. The story of it is essentially the Irodori Festival hadn't been done in a while, Yaimika wants to bring it back, and of course we're the main characters, so we're at the center of it all. In terms of lore, this event wasn't too heavy. For the most part, it was just another fun festival with a lot of character interactions, and of course minigames. Overall, it's not the most loved or most hated event. Spices from the West was a Serenity Teapot event that started when the Serenity Teapot wasn't working fully. It was an event where you would feed the characters and they would actually have voice acted lines depending upon what they ate. It's just unfortunate that this event did not work completely at the start of it. Vibro Crystal Research is a pretty solid combat event. It avoided most of the issues that Study and Potions had. It's basically a spiral abyss with more mechanics involved, but definitely a lot more beginner friendly than the spiral abysses. Abysses. Okay, well. Keep that in. And lastly, outside the canvas, inside the lens, it's a picture taking event. I don't really need to say more than that. If you like it, you like it. If you don't. And yeah, that was 2.6. Definitely one of the more interesting patches of all time, and I'd say it's a pretty good one, all things considered. Now let's get on to the next one. I've done this all in one session and I'm going crazy. It took a while, but 2.7 finally dropped on May 31st. 2.7 had an interesting approach to the way the Archon quest and the mainline event for 2.7 went hand in hand with one another. Some players enjoyed the fact that they were so closely linked, while others didn't. Some thought too little time was given, and others grew frustrated by the rewards being locked behind such late game quests. But at the same time, there was a quick start for this event. I'll talk more about the event later on, so for now I'll just leave it at it's a generally well-liked event with some minor criticisms. And that's about the same assessment you could do for the Archon quest. There is a lot of dialogue, so for some people that's a negative, but on the upside, a lot of the dialogue is quite funny and meaningful. A lot is learned about characters and lore, and if you're a big Zhao fan, this quest is a must. Now, on to the new characters for this patch, and first up we have the 5-star Hydro Bow character Yelan. From the moment of her release, she was a top tier character. She was another Hydro character that heavily focused on the HP stat. Her most direct comparison was Jincho, but she does several things different. For one, her E is a dash that allows for great overworld transport. And while Jincho provides other utilities in his kit, Yelan mainly focuses on just adding more damage. Now, moving on to the new 4-star character Kuki Shinobu. She is an Electro Sword character that focuses on healing and support, but she was also another Electro character that heavily focused on EM, another character released for Dendro before Dendro was even out. The fanbase thought of her as mediocre at best and at worst useless. But because Kuki was put with Yelan and Zhao in the Phase 1 banners, she was still pulled for pretty heavily. The Yelan and Zhao banners would sell very well and at the time be a top 5 selling banner. And Phase 2 also had the first Arataki Ito rerun banner. To quickly touch on the Perilous Trail event, it was mainly combat oriented, with the main twist of the combat section being, at certain points previously used party members cannot be used and you have to continue to adjust your team comps. It was overall a smaller main event, but still not bad, and generally the fanbase thought it was pretty good, other than the previously mentioned critiques. Next is the almighty Arataki Great and Glorious Drumalong Festival, which has to be the longest event name so far, right? Rhythm game fans always love these kind of events, and I think the general player base can also appreciate the customization aspect. People made some crazy awesome songs, it's just unfortunate that those are now gone. Core of the apparatus was a crafting event where you'd help a mechanical toy maker from Fontaine. A part of me can't help but think of this event as Genshin Impact NFTs, as you got to keep a small handful of the toys crafted as furniture for your Serenity Teapot, but you wouldn't be able to get all the options, which was the main critique from the fanbase around the event. A Muddy Bizarre Adventure was a Chasm event that's greatest highlight was the name itself being a JoJo reference. I think out of all the events I've talked about so far, this is the most boring. There's nothing egregiously bad or impressively good, and that wraps up 2.7. An overall okay patch, but in comparison to the new area patches, it's definitely a little lackluster. 2.8 was released on July 13th, and the big draw for the patch was the Summertime Odyssey Limited event, which brought the return of the Golden Apple Archipelago. The Golden Apple Archipelago was in version 1.6, but there were some significant differences between that and 2.8's. The main one being that Fischl got her own castle on Twinning Island. To avoid wasting time, I'm not going to compare the two versions more than that, and I'll touch on the event's storyline later. Now, onto the new playable character for 2.8. Heizo is a 4-star Animo Catalyst character that has a very unique playstyle. Unlike other Catalyst characters, which are basically mages, Heizo actually uses his fists and legs to attack. His overall kit was done very well in making him feel satisfying to play. So even though when he came out he wasn't considered a top tier meta pick, he's still very well liked because of how fun he is. For the Phase 1 banners, Heizo was paired with Kazuha and Klee. This would be Kazuha's first rerun, and it would be a stark contrast to the reception he got on his initial banner. As crazy as it sounds, Kazuha's first banner sold very poorly because people thought his kit was bad. By the time of this rerun, that had already shifted into an overall like of his kit. So overall, the Phase 1 banners were another success for Hoyoverse. Phase 2, however, was quite interesting. It featured Yoimiya in her first rerun. It performed well considering Sumeru was on the horizon. Where things get odd though is Yoimiya was reran again, and just 92 days later in 3.2 with Nahida. By this point, there were already characters that had not had a rerun in over a year. I also also want to briefly mention that Kazuha had his story quest added in this patch, and it was very dialogue heavy. Now onto the Golden Apple Archipelago and the Summertime Odyssey, which is a perfect name for this event because the best way I can sum up this event is teen summer vacation with magic. As the cast of characters for this event and the traveler go through each island, the player experiences various illusions that helps put backstories to everyone involved. It's also a full-blown area with treasure chests and various minigames throughout. Many fans loved this event and hope to see it come back again in 2023. Another 2.8 event we get is Hidden Strife, and it follows a similar theme to the Golden Apple Archipelago. We get like fragments of the past, and we get some backstory on Diluc and Kaya, and it was a pretty good combat event as well. To be clear, it was set in Mondstadt and it was completely separate from the Golden Apple Archipelago. The last event for 2.8 was Ever Motion Mechanical Painting. It's a puzzle mini event, not overly complex, quite refreshing actually. It's another one of those events where players either like it or they don't. Alright, moving on to 2.9, the patch right before Sumeru. Boy, what did we have in store? Hold on. What's that? Oh, there is no 2.9. Okay, moving on. 3.0 was released on August 24th, and it was without a doubt the most hyped update of the year. I think it's safe to say that for most Genshin Impact players, not only did this live up to the hype, but it became one of the best Genshin Impact updates ever. 3.0 brought the first section of Sumeru. It also added the long-awaited Dendro element, and a lot of the previously out-of-place characters found themselves in a much better spot with the new elemental reactions. Sumeru as a region was stunning. Art, music, exploration, the puzzles, the new enemies, the multitude of quest lines. There was also a new artifact set, new craftable weapons, 3 new playable characters, one of which was free. Everything about the Sumeru update was far beyond anything else we had gotten in the past. And to top all of that off, we were told that the next 3 versions would be shortened, so even more content was coming sooner. Alright, let's talk about the playable characters in this patch. Starting with Dendro Traveler. The Dendro Traveler was, and still is, a solid sub DPS with a lot of Dendro application. Because the Traveler could be pre-leveled and all the constellations are free, it was the primary Dendro option when 3.0 first dropped. There was also the 4-star Dendro bow character Kale, which every player got a copy of. She's generally regarded as an okay support. She's a key character in the Archon quest and she's hard to not like. And because of her bow, it made her very useful for some puzzles and world exploration. As of now, there's still not a large amount of Dendro options, so she's still being used by many players today. Plus, the main event of 3.0 gave another copy of Kale. The other character to be released on the 3.0 first phase banners was Tainari, who is also a Dendro bow character. He's also the first 5-star character to be put on the standard banner after the limited banner run ended. A lot of players liken Tainari to a Dendro Ganyu, albeit with much different bursts. The last phase 1 5-star character was Zhongli. Whether it was because players knew Tainari was going on the standard banner, or because they were waiting for a different Dendro 5-star, these banners sold outside the top 10, even with an entirely new element and an Archon. The last new 3.0 character to come out was Dori, an Electro Claymore 4-star, bumping the amount of characters with that combination to 3. Dori is a healer that also provides some energy recharge, and she scales on HP. Character-wise, she was quite well received, but her gameplay had a lukewarm response at best from the majority of the community. The truth is, Dori was put into a pretty tough spot with the sudden rise of Kuki Shinobu and Electro having so many other good support units. Dori was put with the reruns for Ganyu and Sungen no Miya Kokomi. By this point, the public opinion on Kokomi had totally flipped, and Ganyu has always been a fan favorite, so these banners performed decent, but admittedly not as high as I expected when I did the research for this portion. The main limited time event for 3.0 was Graven Innocence. It was essentially an event to help highlight some of the best parts of Sumeru. Combat events for the new enemies, picture events for the new flora and fauna, and speedrun events to get acquainted with the new travel mechanics. I think most Genshin players would agree the main appeal for this event was just the fact that Sumeru was so good and the event itself was nothing special. The next limited event is Tablet Analytics, a combat event where you can use your characters or a variety of trial characters to complete 3 rounds. And based on the player's performance, you get a score which then translates to a certain medal grade. This event was on the easier side, but the combat scenarios were very fun, and getting to trial different characters is always nice. Lost Treasures is a recurring mini event where you very unsurprisingly hunt for treasure. At least with 3.0's version, you get the fabled Weed Sealy. Phase Trials was another combat-oriented event that again lets you trial other characters. The big twist to this combat event though was that you could pause time and focus on weak points to basically nuke your enemies. An okay combat event, if a little gimmicky the more you do it. And that was 3.0, an overall stellar patch that was somehow able to surpass the already immense expectations. 3.1 dropped on September 28th, and it was about as good as a follow-up could possibly be to 3.0. It added the desert area to Sumeru, bringing a whole host of new quests and exploration with it, 3 new characters, 2 of which are 5 stars, a multitude of new enemies were added, 2 of which were bosses, and there was a lot of substantial story happenings in this patch. For starters, the Archon quests continued to build upon what would end up being a great finale in the next patch. The world quests here were also incredibly noteworthy for the great information it added to the most mysterious period in time for Teyvat, and the world quests also introduced a very new way of exploration with the pyramids, and the 2 character story quests added, that being for Cyno and Nilou, are both considered to be very good, if a little dialogue heavy. 3.1 was also the patch that contained the rewards for the 2nd anniversary, which was essentially 20 wishes and some other goodies. This of course brought some drama with it, as some players were not pleased. Some negative reviews were left after this patch, but Hoyoverse stood strong on what they gave out. Now onto the new playable characters of this patch, starting with Candace. She is a 4-star Hydro Polearm character that also on the side has a shield. That shield mainly comes into play when you use her E, which is a parry mechanic. She's also the first character to have Hydro Infusion in her kit. Meta players have deemed her to not be particularly good, but from a design standpoint she's still undeniably a cool character. And if there's anything this year has proven, you never know when a character does become good. Now onto another character that meta players weren't thrilled with, and that is Cyno, the 5-star Electro Polearm character. Part of the issue at the time of his release was Nahida wasn't out, so there wasn't a lot for him to work with in terms of aggravate teams. Another big thing the critics didn't like about him was the fact that he was pretty similar to Razor. Among other criticisms was his lack of knockback resistance and how much field time he demanded. But on the other side, his art design is undeniably beautiful, and his strength is definitely more than necessary to destroy everything the game has to offer. And finally, the last new playable character in this patch, also controversial now that I think about it, Nilou. Nilou is a 5-star Hydro Sword character, having one of the most restrictive kits we've seen so far in Genshin Impact. Her primary mechanics focuses on improving damage from one of the new Dendro reactions, but these abilities will not work unless she's in a team only consisting of Hydro and Dendro characters. And this is where the main controversy stems from this character, or at least disdain for the character. When she came out, there was actually only one viable team comp to run, and even now there's very little options for her. This is an issue that, while not entirely, will for the most part sort itself out going into the future. But in the present, this was the reason that most players skipped her banner. These banner sales are, again, specifically for the iOS Asian market, but out of any new character featured on the new double banner format, she is the least selling. Some of that might contribute to the fact that she was also paired with Albedo, a somewhat more niche character. Whereas the Cyno and Venti banners performed about the same as Tighnari and Zhongli. Now, let's get into the main limited event for 3.1 of Ballads and Brews. It surprisingly takes place in Mondstadt and is centered around, of course, a wine festival. The event consisted of running a stall, taking care of some enemies, and doing some gliding, of course. The main highlight from this event was definitely the character interactions, specifically Razor's character had a lot of development in this. It was an overall lighthearted event and nothing too serious. The second event was Haikyun and Ikki. Again, it's such a well-known event. It's the second time it happened this year. I'll leave it at that. The next event is Wind Chaser, which basically functions as a platformer. Some fans were disappointed by this event, namely from the fact that there's no customization aspects, but overall it's an okay event. The funniest thing is how some players would cheese with animo characters, myself included. The last event is Starseeker's Sojourn, basically a treasure hunt crossed with a puzzle solver. It was lighthearted and it allowed for players to see more of the beautiful scenery in Sumeru, so overall it's a fine event. And that wraps up 3.1. Like I said in the beginning, an overall strong patch and a great follow-up to 3.0. And the fact that it came out early doesn't hurt either, right? 3.2 came out November 2nd, and although there was no new area in this patch, there was still some significant content additions. Namely, the long-awaited Dendro Archon Nahida was added as a playable character, along with the 4-star Layla. The Archon quest in Sumeru also hit its climax, ending in a boss fight with the Fatui Harbinger Scaramouche. This patch also had the infamous Yoimiya rerun as well as Yaimiko and Tartaglia in Phase 2, which is where Layla was. Talking more about Nahida as a playable character, there's a lot of expectations in the community when an Archon comes out, and for the most part, Nahida lived up to those expectations. Her kit was incredibly powerful, but there was a small set of players that were expecting Nahida to have a special dash like Mona and Ayaka because there had been a bug with Mona and Ayaka's dashes for the longest time, and it happened to be patched just before 3.0 was set to be released. Like I said, that was a small set of players, and on Nahida's release, it was almost unanimously agreed that she was a great character overall. This is backed up by the sales data because this is the second best-selling banner of all time, only losing out to the Ayaka banner, which lasted forever in 2.6. Moving on to the new 4-star character in this patch, we have Layla, a cryo sword character who is sleep deprived and is enrolled in the academia. Layla was probably one of the strongest 4-stars we got this year, but she was directly compared to another 4-star that's also considered very strong in Diona. The reason for that is they are both cryo supports that provide shields to the team. But whereas Diona heals, Layla provides a better shield and more DPS. Regardless of the comparisons, Layla is a great character overall in terms of personality and kit, and another great addition to the insanely large Genshin Impact cast. The last big permanent addition to 3.2, other than the Serenity Teapot having replication, were the two bosses they added, one being the Dendro Hypostasis, and the other being a juiced up Scaramouche who not only has the Electro-Gnosis, but it has a full-blown mech, making him have power rivaling gods. And you really feel that throughout the entirety of this boss fight. The sheer size comparison between Scaramouche and you, the weakness of your attacks, the reliance on Nahida's power. It's more of a cinematic marvel than an actual boss fight in comparison to someone like Raiden Shogun. Overall, there's very few patches that do as many great things story-wise as this one. The main limited event for this patch is Fabulous Fungus Frenzy, say that 5 times fast, and it's on the more calm end of main events. It's basically an event where the fungus monsters throughout Sumeru become Pokemon, and of course when you have Pokemon involved there's gotta be a tournament, and of course since it's a video game there's gotta be a dark undertone and evil plot involved. But really, it is fun having your fungus fight like Pokemon against other people having their fungus fight like Pokemon. The biggest critique of the event is that there is no online aspect to it. The next event is outside the canvas, inside the lens, and it's another photo taking event. There's not really much I can add to that. If you like it, you like it, and if you don't, you don't. Hypostatic Symphony is the combat event for this patch. It is a recurring event, but we hadn't seen it since 1.2, so it's been quite a while. I would like to say it's a fan favorite like Haikyun and Ikki, but there are some conflicting opinions on this one. The main one being a lot of players don't like fighting Hypostasis because of their long states of invulnerability. This isn't a controversial event or anything, but it does have people that dislike it. Last event is Adventure Trials, which is basically a minigame compilation, and that's 3.2. Not as content filled as some patches, but what is there is high quality. At last, we are at the final patch of 2022. 3.3 was released on December 7th. The biggest feature of this patch was no doubt the TCG added to the game. There were so many ways Hoyoverse could have gone about it, but they truly made a well-rounded card game here. Going forward, the Genius Invocation TCG will continue to get free updates, adding on to an already great game. In this patch, Scaramouche becomes a playable character, and he also gets a redemption arc in the interlude. The 4-star Animo Bow character Farazan is also released in this patch. This patch also had reruns for Arataki Ito, Raiden Shogun, and Ayato, with Raiden Shogun and Ayato being the Phase 2 characters, and Scaramouche and Arataki Ito along with Farazan as the Phase 1 characters. This patch also adds 2 new artifact sets. One set is for Scaramouche and the other is for Bloom teams. Now on to the Wanderer's kit, as he no longer goes by Scaramouche. He is a 5-star Animo Catalyst with a heavy focus on flight and maintaining it while in combat. Raining down charge attacks and stepping on people is Scaramouche's bread and butter. Sorry, the Wanderer. In terms of overworld traversal, the Wanderer is by far the best character in the game. His gameplay is definitely very satisfying, but his lack of knockback resistance while in flight mode can be very annoying for some players. The Wanderer and Arataki Ito banners along with Farazan sold just outside the top 5 all time, so clearly the community likes him to a decent extent. I unfortunately can't speak on the Raiden Shogun and Ayato rerun banner sales because they are not over with yet at the time of this video. Now on to Farazan. Farazan. In terms of kit, Farazan is pretty comparable to Kujo Sara. She fits a very specific niche and entirely focuses on supporting Anemo DPS characters. Meta players find Farazan at C0 to be almost useless, and she's considered the worst elemental buffer. At C6 she's better, but still a very niche character. To be clear, this is the meta player perspective and not the general community. Aesthetically and lore wise she's very interesting, and any character is viable in the overworld. The final main limited time event of the year is Akitsu Kimo Dameshi. Sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly. And yeah, it's an Inazuma event that focuses on yokai. We have tests of courage and for some reason an extensive new age Pong game that I found very fun. All of the Inazuma fan favorites were in this event, and the lore dumps throughout it were also pretty intriguing. It's harder to gauge the community opinion on this event because it literally just ended, but I'll say for myself I thought it was pretty solid. Although the Pong minigame really did catch me off guard. Misty Dungeon Realm of Sand combines both exploration and combat into one event. It was a somewhat short and somewhat easy event, but you did get to trial some new characters, and that's always a good thing to have. And lastly, we got to finish the year with the classic event Windtrace. Genshin Prop Hunt for the win. I would consider 3.3 one of the weaker patches of the year. A weaker Genshin patch is still far better than a lot of the games I've played in my life though. Alright, and that's all folks. Wow, what a year for Genshin Impact. When I first started this video, I had no idea it was going to be this long. So if someone does make it this far, thank you so much. Also, big thank you to the people that work on the wiki. Without your guys' work, my life would have been a lot more difficult here. Another thanks to any player who posts on forums about Genshin. Trust me, I sifted through so much to get all the opinions I could. And lastly, thank you to Hoyoverse. I know it's popular to dump on them. They're definitely not a perfect company, but this game is truly special. And yeah, let's hope for a good 2023.